Hi, thanks for tuning into my YouTube channel. I'm Reverend MeeLing, been known by a few names: Reverend MeeLing, Reverend Susan MeeLing, Lady MeeLing, Lady Dori, Belle. A few other names. That is what it is. So, in reference to scuba diving and the depths in the ocean that I had been. So, some things that some people might not have taken into consideration that don't necessarily have the background or the means to look up in certain regards for an actuality sort of thing. So if you take a look at the tallest mountain, I believe that's Mount Everest, correct? It's several, however many thousands or tens of thousands of feet um, straight up, right? If you take that into consideration, plus also the elevation of the landmass that it's technically in, along with the fact that it's solid, it doesn't move except for when there's earthquakes. And then you take into consideration the fact that whatever continent these not just Mount Everest, but you've got the Rocky Mountains, you've got the Appalachian Mountains in reference to the United States of America. And so only buoyant things float, correct? Yes, it was a rhetorical question. So with only buoyant things floating and the land that people are walking on, driving on, whatever it is, however you are, it is solid. So it is in, like through to the core, all that sort of stuff. You have the bottom of the ocean, which is land. It is not buoyant, right? Yes, the answer is yes. Thus, with that aspect, and then in reference to when I had landed at the bottom of the ocean, not specifically just the 3 different times, though in a more specific reference to when in the Matthias Abyss at the bottom of the ocean. So if you go and look at any naval aircraft carrier that is in whatever vicinity nearby, so in Washington State, you have the Bremerton Naval Shipyard, and there are others, of course, because you've got Everett and so on and so forth, the naval base there. And then you also have, like, for example, in the East Coast, you have the USS New Jersey that's out there. And all along the coastline, you have different Coast Guard ships and different Navy ships and naval ports that you are able, within reason, to see the size of. So in order to that to be not buoyant, which would mean it would sink to the bottom of the ocean, you have to also take into consideration the amount of space that would be necessary, at minimum, for submarines, not just current ones, but ones that are in the process of being made, to be able to pass through. And not just currently being made, but even in the works of. So when you take a look into consideration of certain patents, so the patents that have been out and been working on and so on and so forth, a minimum of 20 to 25 years for some, if not longer, depending on the type of naval vessel. And then you also have to take into consideration also the cruise ships and yachts and so on and so forth going over the specific vicinity of where the Vandenberg is at the same time in different patterns. So, a submarine going this way and a cruise ship going that way, or crossing, or just various ways, and being able to guess what the downward draught would be, which is the force of pressure from the water of the ocean to make sure that the Vandenberg doesn't tip over, which gives a bigger aspect in reference to how deep the Vandenberg is in the Atlantic area of the ocean in the Matthias Abyss. So taking that into consideration, as well as the fact that land mass is not buoyant, it is solid. So while there are cracks and crevices where you have underwater or underground springs and caverns and the like, and you also have lakes and creeks and rivers, you have to take that into consideration also in reference to how deep it is in reference to where the Vandenberg is. So with all of that, when you could go to your sink and, put something to see what it would look like to sink it as a smaller scale example, and be able to have a smaller view as to how far I was in the ocean. And so, while my particular depth gauge had been measured in atmospheric measurements, which one atmospheric measurement, or one ATM, is the equivalent of 33 meters, which 1 meter is 3 feet-ish. I mean, there's a few inches that are added to that. Nonetheless, one atmospheric measurement being equivalent of 33 feet, one atmospheric measurement of 33 meters times 3 for the feet, and then that is how many feet per atmospheric measurement. That is what is known at this point in time. So, with the maximum amount of numbers being a total of 9 nines for the depth gauge computer that I had when going scuba diving, and when it hits all 9s, that means it's maxed out, right? For pretty much anything. Either that or it goes to 0. However, that's not the case when it came to my depth gauge measurement for scuba diving. So it was 9 different 9s. And so to do the mathematics on that, you take 999, comma, 999, comma, 999 times 33 for the atmospheric measurements, the number, and then multiply that number by 3, and that's how many feet. However, you also have to take into consideration the fact that it was maxed out. That being said, because it was maxed out, the actual depth, because it is in the abyss, is how deep I was in the ocean. Back in August of 2009, when going to the Vandenberg. Now, while it seems for most logic-thinking individuals with the linear thought process in regards to scientific analogs, there would be the issue in reference to processing that particular number because, well, it's an unknown equation when you realistically look at it, because I would guesstimate that, of course, when putting whatever monitoring devices onto the Vandenberg to see that sort of aspect, the depth gauge for their particular measurement technology pieces would probably be maxed out as well. And whether it measures in atmospheric measurements or feet, which I would guesstimate it would most likely be in atmospheric measurements, that would be the easier aspect for a better reading, then you have to take into consideration in that reference of the mountains and how much it is in solidity to be able to stay up, as well as the aspects in reference to the continental area. And in regards of, for example, the Oriskany, the USS Oriskany, that was sunk off of the South Carolina shoreline, and it was supposed to be sunk where the top of the tower is, I think they said, from what I've read, 115 feet. If that is accurate and is not 115 atmospheric measurements, and that's just off of the continental shelf of the United States of America coastline. That gives another reference point for the actual depth that I had been when scuba diving in the vicinity of the USS or USNS Vandenberg. Now, again, I was told I couldn't go in to the Vandenberg. I didn't go in. I wasn't told I couldn't land at the bottom. Realistically, not that that would have stopped me. I'm a little ornery, just a smidgen. I mean, for example, I mean, I didn't do any damage to anywhere I had been. And so, in reference to scuba diving in Cozumel on the other side of the Cozumel Island, closer to the deeper aspects of the Gulf of Mexico, while all of the other scuba divers stayed, you know, more up. I knew how not to kick up the silt. And that would be why, in reference to this particular picture that I took of this albino eel that I found, I am not technically that far from him. Because, well, first off, the zoom on the camera, the underwater camera that I had, it max zoomed to 10 millimeters. However, that was not zoomed when I landed. And so, you know, that's how close I was. He listened. Yeah, follow and didn't cause any problems, didn't bite me, didn't bite any of the other scuba divers I was with. Listen though. Cute patootie. And so, but for that reference point, so there are guys who have been in the Coast Guard, in the Marine Corps, and in the Navy, as well as different elected officials who, whether they have naval areas in their states for shipbuilding as well, you know, the average mountain, if going off of feet, would be the equivalent of from the keel underneath the hull of the ship to the actual deck for more of the larger mountains, for a visual above ground, for how deep I was. So, in that reference, if, and that is a big if, there are individuals that are actually wanting those two particular scuba divers that I found when scuba diving in the Vandenberg area. I know I've completed a video prior to this. However, I can understand that there'd be some individuals who would be a little nervous. In regards of dropping down, and or a little nervous in reference to, I had already done it once, so, you know, there were health concerns, but I took care of them for myself because didn't have anybody to assist with that at that time, in regards to what I needed to make sure of for myself. And so, if it's preferred that I just go by myself, okay, I can do that and surface, no problem. That's obvious. I've done it before, obviously. If it is preferred that I scuba dive with others, I can do that. I have an idea for the regiment in that regard of how to practice and that sort of aspect because of it being such a deep dive, but not just because of it being a deep dive, also because of the requirements in order to safely bring those two individual scuba divers to the surface. And what it would take to be able to remove what is binding them in the vicinity, which that does take certain aspects, I understand. But yeah, it can be done. But if it's preferred I go by myself, I can do that. However, if it's preferred that I go with others, that's not a problem either. That's a few different aspects of training. Though I understand that because it is so deep, there might be some fear. I mean, realistically, I'm not scared. I did it once before, I can do it again. And so, if the divers are wanting, you know, if there are law enforcement officials that are wanting to have that retrieval. But more in reference to this particular official YouTube video, the aspects for understanding for other individuals who don't necessarily have that ability to go and see the difference in person for themselves, despite the fact that I have recorded some official YouTube videos of mine where, you know, I'm closer to different ships, such as the Kitty Hawk and the Lexington. And so, though, yes, the reality is that those two particular scuba divers that are down in that vicinity are deeper than where the Vandenberg is. So, there is that consideration in that regard as well. But I can do it, no problem. If it's wanted. If not, at least it's known. Well, hopefully, I guess. Anyway, so for that understanding, you know, the Earth is obviously, the globe is round. And so the areas where the ocean is, and the different areas between the different continents, you have the kind of like a, realistically when you think about it, it is like the equivalent of your countertop would be the land. And then the sink that you have would be the equivalent of what the ocean would be like, for a more in-person sort of ease. And so for a better understanding, where you have the actual sink bottom, that would be the equivalent of one of the continental shelves to your countertop. And the abyss, where I landed, would essentially be inside of your cabinet underneath your sink on the ground. For a better example, to make it easier. Not necessarily to scale, though I would guesstimate that there might be some scientists that would be able to say, well, you know, it's not, it probably would say not necessarily to scale, but enough of a commonality for a visual for the understanding in an in-person sort of way. So the countertop, you know, pretend, well, obviously this is a countertop, so you have the countertop, and then, you know, you got, like, let's say right here is the sink that you have in your counter. All the way at the bottom would be where I landed. And so, and surfaced, obviously. So today is the 19th of June, 2020, just for that understanding. The scuba dive that I had done in the Vandenberg area, where it's in the Bermuda Triangle, which is also in the Matthias Abyss area. That'd be where I was at. And surfaced after scuba diving in August of 2009. So, however, in reference to the video I did a couple of days ago where I swam out to where the Lexington is to, you know, be next to it-ish and still just walking, you know, despite the waves and whatever. you know, how tall is the Pilsum line from the keel of the ship onto the hull? At least for the Lexington. I don't know. It's probably more than a foot in height. But yeah, so if you have the ability in the state of Texas to go to the Lexington, you can have that as an example. And I've given the other examples. Or if you've ever been on a cruise ship. I haven't actually seen cruise ships up close in person, though I would guesstimate that that would give you a good example as to, you know, if you went down into the deepest part of the hull of the cruise ship to go to the top of the cruise ship, you'd be able to get a good enough of an example as to, you know, how tall the Vandenberg is. In a smaller scale, because that's a passenger ship instead of a military ship. So hopefully that makes sense and gives a better bit of an understanding for that regard. So you guys have a good one. Comment, like, share, and subscribe to my official YouTube channel.